Good afternoon. I am Juliette Trey. I'm a curator at the Prints and Drawings department at the Musée du Louvre in Paris and co-curator of the Bouchardon exhibition that took place in Paris. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second part of this Bouchardon symposium. And I'm delighted to serve as moderator for this panel of distinguished scholars. So let me introduce our first speaker for the afternoon, Dr. Monique Kornell. She's an independent scholar whose area of research is anatomical book illustration, écorché models, and the study of anatomy by artists. She has published articles on anatomical drawings, prints, and anatomy books from the 16th to the 18th centuries. She was co-curator of the Ingenious Machine of Nature, 4 Centuries of Art and Anatomy, an exhibition of prints and drawings organized by the National Gallery of Canada in 1996. A doctoral thesis at the Warburg Institute was on artists and the study of anatomy in 16th century Italy. And she's currently a short-term research fellow at UCLA, working on the mid-16th century illustrations in the anatomy books of Andrea Vesalius. So, as you've clearly understood, she's a great specialist of anatomy, and she will talk to us this afternoon about Bouchardon's unusual anatomy book for artists, L'anatomie nécessaire pour l'usage du dessin, in context. So please join me in welcoming Monique Kornell to the podium.
So thank you, Juliette, for your kind introduction, and my thanks to the organizers of this splendid exhibition for the honor of participating in this conference today. I will be speaking about Bouchardon's anatomy book for artists, a rather unusual one, as we shall see. I show you the title page and one of the figures from L'anatomie nécessaire pour l'usage du dessin, or Anatomy Necessary for the Use of Design, which appeared in 1741 with etchings after the preparatory drawings by the printmaker-publisher Gabriel Houquier. A keen observer of the human body, Bouchardon favored a natural rather than stylized representation. As far as his knowledge of anatomy is concerned, he owned human and equine anatomy books at his death and drew from écorché models, figures without skin that displayed the superficial muscles. Of his surviving representations of anatomy, all his surviving representations of anatomy can connected to these. Houquier, who had previously collaborated with Bouchardon on books of academy figures and vase designs, may have been capitalizing on Bouchardon's reputation as a draftsman, one with a supreme command of the human form, as is evidenced in his academy drawings. I introduce the book to you the way it was presented to the French public through the announcement in the Mercure de France in October 1741. There, it was described as a treatise of anatomy for the use of those who apply themselves to design, with illustrations after original drawings by Bouchardon, sculptor to the king. The anatomical explanation is described as reduced to a concise table, as seen on your left, so as not to discourage the young student. Below the names of the bones are the names of the muscles, along with a brief account of their function. On the right is one of 3 figures of transparent anatomy said to offer at a glance the system of bones and muscles. The announcement also says an écorché model after the same drawings on which the book is based will be available for sale at Houquier's shop, along with other books for those who wish to learn the art of drawing. Aside from the general table, there is no other text, besides a single page addressed to the reader that repeats the themes of the announcement. The book is composed of 15 numbered illustrations, including the title page. All the figures have a raised arm. I show you images from the copy in the Getty Research Institute, which is a later edition, datable to around 1787 to 89, according to the printer's imprint. Following the 3 views of a skeleton are 8 views of muscle figures, all of them on round bases. The final 2 muscle figures differ from the preceding ones is that the face is upturned, the left arm raised, with the right a curled hand against the hip and the left heel raised. Concluding the book, there are 3 figures of transparent anatomy that show the bones overlaid with muscles, with some attempt at showing their attachments to the bones. Although the announcement and the books addressed to the reader describe the illustrations as after Edme Bouchardon, the 6 views of skeletons and transparent anatomy bear the signature at the lower left of Edme's younger brother, Jean-Philippe, as designer. Looking more closely at the illustrations, one may discern differences in scale and setting between those drawn by Edme and Jean-Philippe. Whereas the skeletons and transparent figures mostly fit within the frame of the plates, the muscle figures regularly break the frame at the wrist and are shown with truncated hands. In the 9th plate, even the model's base breaks out of the frame. Although the book bears his name as author, Edme Bouchardon contributed only 8 of the anatomical figures, nor, as it turns out, did he compose the explanatory table or the unsigned address to the reader, which were likely supplied by Houquier. In the latter, the author relates that he had wanted to publish prints after Bouchardon's drawings just as they were, but that many people found that they were not instructive enough. So he added the names of the muscles and their principal uses to a general table, keeping it simple, avoiding those things that were useful for surgeons. And I quote, "It seems that Houquier was the guiding force in the creation of the book. The drawings may have been commissioned by Houquier, but it is also very likely that they were products of the sculptor's personal study." Another aspect that separates Bouchardon's illustrations from his brothers are that for the muscle figures, there is no indication of a background except the cast shadow in the 9th figure, whereas the skeleton and transparent anatomy figures are shown on an indication of ground with a bit of vegetation in 2 plates confirming that the setting is outdoors. In their fictive animation and setting, the skeleton and transparent figures conform to an established tradition dating back to the early 16th century of placing an anatomical figure in a landscape, in an active pose. I'm referring here primarily to complete skeleton and muscle figures. The popularity of the frequently copied illustrations of Andreas Vesalius' De Humani Corporis Fabrica of 1543, seen on the left, codified this mode of representation. Both Bouchardon and Houquier owned multiple copies of editions of Vesalius at their deaths. They each also owned a copy of François Tortebat and Roger de Pile's Abrégé d'Anatomie, or Abridgment of Anatomy, seen on the right, the first anatomy book purely for artists. First published in 1668 with a dedication to the Academy of Painting and Sculpture, it was illustrated with plates after Vesalius. Mariette, Bouchardon's friend and supporter, published an edition in 1733. The concern for simplicity and brevity with a focus only on what is useful for the artists rather than for surgeons is echoed in Bouchardon's book. And in fact, even the wording is the same in some parts, but de Pile speaks of avoiding the infinite subjects of medicine that are useless for painters, and the address to the reader of Bouchardon book says that it will avoid the infinite number of things useful only to surgery. The 2 editions of Vesalius that Bouchardon owned were illustrated with figures that ultimately derive from engraved copies published by Thomas Geminus in 1545 that simplify the landscape setting and delete the architectural elements. I will show you some muscle figures from the 1617 edition published in Amsterdam that was included in Bouchardon's posthumous sale. All of the anatomy books Bouchardon owned at his death gave animated crochet figures a landscape setting. Listed in Bouchardon's posthumous sale is an undated copy of Jean Cousin's L'Art de dessiner, And I show this anatomical and proportional illustration from an edition of 1685, the design of which dates back to the late 16th century. Even equine anatomy was given this treatment, as seen in Carlo Ruini's Anatomia del Cavallo, first published in 1598. Bouchardon is recorded as owning an undated Italian edition of this book. Here is the 1599 Venice edition, also in the Getty Research Institute, as are many of the book illustrations that I am showing today. The image of the animated dissected figure gambling in nature persisted into the 18th century. Taking the impossible to further extremes are the partially dissected walking legs striding away from the sea, produced for the Italian anatomist Casseri in the late 16th century, but published in 1627. On the right is the skeleton of the Apollo Belvedere holding the handle of his bow, in Cheselden's magnificent osteographia published in London in 1733. Generally, the trope of the animated, anatomized figure in a landscape setting is one that is consistently repeated in early anatomical illustration, although there are notable exceptions, such as this figure on the left, designed in the 1560s for the Italian anatomist Bartolomeo Eustacchi, but only published for the first time in 1714. Even in the atlas of the Dutch anatomist Govard Bidloo, a copy of which Houquier owned, which famously treats dissections as very inanimate still lives, a skeleton holds his shroud and steps into his grave against a background of classical antiquity, turning his head to acknowledge the viewer. Elements of portraiture, a French drawing book of 1630 by Jean de Saint-Igny, features several living muscle figures out in the world. This figure, complete with hair and beard stylish for the period, stands in a contemporary populated landscape with such daily scenes as soldiers gathered in the background on the left, and on the right, a cart crossing a bridge. 6 years after the appearance of Bouchardon's book, attention to background would reach its apogee with Albinus's magnificent Tabula Skeleti et Musculorum Corpus Humani, first published in Leiden in 1747, with illustrations by Jan van der Laar. The purpose of showing these examples is to point out not only the tradition to which the skeleton and transparent illustrations of Bouchardon's anatomy book belong, but also to highlight the difference between this tradition and Bouchardon's muscle figures. Firstly, they are shown without a landscape setting. This point is demonstrated by the contrast in how this muscle figure of Bouchardon on the right appears when it is copied some 17 years later in an anatomy book by François-Michel Disdier. There, it is given a verdant background more in keeping with the norms of anatomical illustration, and, as if to bolster the impression of an outdoor setting, the base now shows wear as if exposed to the elements over time. Bouchardon's figures are fixed on their circular stands. These are not figures capable of moving about, and the conceit of the animated cadaver has been abandoned. These are studies of crochet figures, models kept in studios and studied by artists, offering a three-dimensional view of the muscles just below the skin. Such models became popular first in the 16th century, and I show you a bronze and a drawing of two types from that period that are close precursors to ones that Bouchardon knew. In terms of anatomy books for artists, Bouchardon's was the first, to my knowledge, to show crochet models as inanimate objects on their bases. This presentation is markedly different from the 17th century crochet model depicted in the anatomy book produced for the French Academy of Rome by the anatomist Bernardino Genga in collaboration with Charles Erard, the Academy's founding director, and the papal physician Giovanni Maria Lancisi. It was published in 1691 with a title that translates as Anatomy for the Use and Understanding of Design. And here's this model in Jenga in another view. Whereas earlier anatomical illustration may have derived from anatomical models, in Jenga's book, the source is clearly acknowledged. The figure is described as an anatomical model of the surface of the body as taken from a cadaver for the service of the Royal French Academy in Rome. Yet, despite its origin as an accouché model, it is seen here in a landscape setting, lit by sunlight, separate only from the world of the living by its lack of skin. Bouchardon drew from an accouché model in multiple views, sometimes varying the viewpoint only by a few degrees. Drawing an accouché model in this fashion was specifically promoted in the address to the reader, where it was suggested that the student draw a model purchasable from Houquier's shop from every side so that he can be accustomed to correctly muscle all the parts of the human body. This recommendation repeats a part of a directive earlier given by Tépile in the Abrégé d'Anatomie of 1668, which calls for drawing from every side, and I quote, one of those fine figures of anatomy in the round, before studying anatomy, as found in antique sculpture in the nude. Making studies from multiple views was also a characteristic of Bouchardon's drawing practice, whether from life or sculpture. He followed a sculptor's inclination to fully grasp an object in the round. Here are three of many existing views in the Louvre of a cast of the central figure of the Lacan group. It's very slow to load. There we go. The same approach is seen in his exquisite drawings after an accouché horse, some of which retain the model's base, as clearly seen in the upper right drawing. An accouché model known as Bouchardon's was recorded in sale catalogues and letters of the time, and it enjoyed some popularity until usurped by that of Houdon's in the late 18th century. Three of Bouchardon's accouchés are listed in the sales of Houquier before and after the printmaker's death in 1772. On the right, we see a drawing for Houquier's address card dated from the 1750s, when his shop was on the Rue de Maturin. It bears the title, Various Prints for the Study of Design. On the second shelf on the right, we see a portfolio of prints devoted to anatomy, between prints of academies and perspective. Whoops. Just about there. On the mantelpiece is a model, possibly an accouché, in a pose that is similar, if not exactly like those found in Bouchardon's books. A closer match is the accouché on the left, now lost, but once in the École des Beaux-Arts, known as Bouchardon's accouché. There exists also a life-size accouché model in a different pose that is first recorded with an attribution to Bouchardon only in the mid-19th century. The multiplicity of views in which the 8 muscle figures are presented also distinguishes Bouchardon's anatomy book as unusual. More common were the canonical 3 views from the front, the side, and the back, which were the most economical way of showing the complete form, particularly when there were several layers of anatomy to depict. It is in these 3 views that the skeleton and transparent figures of Jean-Philippe are shown in the book. So on the left are 3 views of anatomy in Jean Bert's drawing book of 1740, which with etchings by Boss after Vesalius, and on the right, the skeleton, muscle, and nude figures compared in Alexander Brown's Ars Pictoria of 1669. And here's Cousin again with 3 views and Ruini. An exception is found in Genga's book for the Academy of Rome of 1691. It includes a remarkable series of illustrations by Erard of famous statues of antiquity considered anatomically. These are presented flayed and in several views, the most being the 6 views of the Borghese gladiator. I know of no documentary evidence that these were based on actual 3-dimensional models, unlike Galbert Salvage's book of 1812, for which he made casts of cadavers set in the pose of the gladiator. Another quite innovative aspect of Bouchardon's book is found in the 3 transparent figures of Jacques Philippe. There was no established tradition of this style of representation in anatomical atlases, although it appears in 16th century drawings and in a drawing book by Hidalgo of the 17th century. A more immediate inspiration is found in this plate by Crisostomo Martinez. Martinez was a Spanish engraver and anatomist who traveled to Paris in the late 17th century and who devoted his studies to the microscopy of bones. He drew and engraved his own illustrations, but only this plate and one other were published in 1689. They were republished in Paris in August of 1740, a little more than a year before the appearance of Bouchardon's anatomy book in October of 1741. Finally, to return to the title page, lyrical and attractive as it may be, beyond the title, it holds little indication of the subject of the book. Not even on the scrolled sheet the Puto holds up to the viewer, where one might hope to see a bone or a muscle. Instead, we see an indication of a nude and a suggestion of a tree, nor is there any specificity on the medals that tumble out of the cornucopia. Bouchardon was not averse to providing title pages that reflected the themes of the books for which they were drawn, as we see in this allegory of architecture with attributes in this frontispiece translation of Vignola in 1738 on the left, or, from the same year, the title page to one of the Academy figure books published by Houquier. To better appreciate the oddity of Bouchardon's title page, we should briefly consider what a title page for an anatomy book could look like. Many consisted of a simple letterpress, as did Tourtebin and Depeal's Abrégé d'Anatomie when it first appeared in 1668, and again on the right when it was republished by Mariette in 1733. On the left is the title page of a book of anatomy of 1569 by Jacques Gravin with illustrations after Vesalius. It is likely that this is the edition that Bouchardon owned, as I believe the date of 1669 given in his posthumous cell catalogue is in error. Often, though, anatomy books had title pages that featured scenes of dissection and included anatomical details, like the 1617 edition of Vesalius owned by Bouchardon, seen in the center. No opportunity for an anatomical reference is lost here, down to the decorative swag of bones below the title cartouche, or above it, the monkey and pig, frequent subjects of dissection for comparative anatomy. Jacob Lajer-Burcharth's anatomy book, The Outermost Things of Human Bodies, published in 1634 in Dutch, was marketed to artists as well as to surgeons. In the title page, personifications on painting and sculpture direct the reader to join the spectators who are observing the partially flayed cadaver suspended by a rope. On the right is Erard's frontispiece to Genga's anatomy book, where time and death contemplate the end of all men, rich or poor, according to the inscription. So now I invite you to compare Bouchardon's title page with that of Gérard Delaresse's for Bidlu's Anatomia Humani Corporis, published in 1685. Both are allegorical title pages with architectural elements and delightful putti. Bidloux's title page, however, is full of anatomical references. While Bouchardon's Pouty retrieve medals out of a cornucopia or point to a drawing of a plein air nude, Bidloux's are engaged in anatomical research. Two in the foreground are investigating a skull and the muscles of an arm, while a third holds up what appears to be an anatomical illustration. The fourth, who stands with a draped head and a raised arm next to the seated personification of anatomy, is himself a subject of dissection. The lack of anatomical reference in Bouchardon's title page suggests that it was not designed with the purpose of illustrating anatomy books for artists, and it could easily have been repurposed from another project, perhaps to do with drawing, given the sheet the Pouto holds up and the porte-crayon the winged genius holds. Adding this to the disparity in presentation between the figures by Bouchardon and those by his brother, and that it was Fouquier who likely added the explanatory table and presumably the corresponding lettering on the figures, one is left with the overall impression that this book was improvised around Bouchardon's drawings after crochet models, ones that he might have done for his own study. Although there are mentions in early sales, no surviving drawings related to the book have been identified. This is in striking contrast to the abundance of drawings that survive by Bouchardon concerning equine anatomy. There are drawings after the woodcut illustrations in Ruini's book, which Bouchardon owned, and a series of drawings dated after 1742, according to the watermarks, that are made of a model of a horse related to Ruini's illustrations, casts of which became available in the 1740s. Some of these drawings are highly finished, carefully lettered and labeled, in contrast to the drawings for the anatomie nécessaire, to which lettering and an explanatory table were added as an afterthought. And it has been plausibly proposed that Bouchardon had planned on publishing a book of equine anatomy. Like the anatomie nécessaire, this would have been based on an crochet model drawn in multiple views. But the model's base has now given way in most of the drawings to an integration of a ground line, one which falls away in the drawing on the right, giving the impression of impending descent and a great sense of vivacity. Whether as preparatory for a book or for Bouchardon's own reference, the drawings should be seen as part of his devoted interest in the horse, which supported his extensive preparations for the equestrian monument of Louis XV, commissioned in 1748. The installation of Hans Hacke's gift horse on the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square in 2015 brought to my mind, and perhaps yours, Bouchardon's horse anatomy drawings and his lost bronze of Louis XV on horseback, but without the digital stock ticker tape wrapped in a bow on the raised foreleg. It seems that Bouchardon's book enjoyed some popularity. 2 decades after its first appearance, it was among the anatomy books recommended by Francesco Algarotti. The 18th century Spanish artist, Ramon Baeu, put it on his list of items to purchase on a trip to Paris. Bouchardon's contemporary, Jean-Baptiste Lemoine, owned a copy, and, not surprisingly, one also made its way into the extensive library of the English physician and collector Sir Richard Mead. Bouchardon's anatomy was first published during a brief period when the instruction of anatomy had fallen out of favor at the French Academy in preference for the living model and the study of the antique and great masters. Perhaps Fouquier was responding to a demand for a didactic manual of anatomy aimed at artists. Whatever Fouquier's thinking at the time, there was indeed a market for a simple, short anatomy book. Except for an edition of 1802, copies of Bouchardon's book do not bear a date and have generally been dated to 1741, according to the Mercure de France announcement. However, a study of printer imprints established that there were at least 6 editions into the early 19th century, making the book, for all of its unusual features, one of the more successful examples of the genre. And I show a sample of some of these imprints, which can be dated by the years of activity of the different printers at the addresses given. Despite long being familiar with Bouchardon's anatomy book, I only finally noticed that there was a variance in the imprints when I learned that the Getty and the Louvre were planning an exhibition, and I examined the copy here at the Getty Research Institute, as well as one in the Young Research Library at UCLA. So in conclusion, I want to thank the organizers of this remarkable exhibition for bringing Bouchardon back into view and restoring to him some of the great fame and high esteem he enjoyed in his own time. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Monique, for this very interesting talk. We're now moving on to our second speaker, Eva Lajer-Burcharth. Eva Lajer-Burcharth is the William Dorr Boardman Professor of Fine Arts in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Harvard University. She teaches modern and contemporary art, focusing on the 18th and 19th centuries, post-1970s art, and critical theory. She is the author of Necklines, The Art of Jacques-Louis David After the Terror, which was published in 1999, yes. She also published Chardin Material and The Painter's Touch, Bouchardon, Fragonard, which was published this year. Yes. Oh, okay. It will be published this year. And she recently co-edited and contributed to Drawing, The Invention of a Modern Medium, a catalogue of an exhibition she has co-organized at the Harvard Art Museum. So Professor Lajer-Burcharth is currently working on a book project on drawing in the 18th century, Drawing and Modernity, Watteau, Saint-Aubin, Fragonard. And the title of a paper is very intriguing and exciting, Bouchardon's Body.
Which one was mine now? This is mine, right? Okay. Thank you, Juliette. Thank you, the organizers of this fantastic symposium, and also curators of the exhibition, which is fabulous, which I have seen 4 times in Paris, and just run through here. It's really incredible treat. Okay. Let's see whether it works. Walking through a recent exhibition of a 20th century Italian artist, Marisa Meret, in New York, I was confronted with the artist's impressive body of work in drawing and sculpture. Her parallel practices in these two mediums posed a basic question. What is the nature of the relation between the sculptor's drawings and three-dimensional forms? How, for example, do Meret's residually figurative shapes emerging from behind the dense curtains of graphite strokes in the drawing on the left relate to her embryonal and unformed or deformed clay busts in the middle and on the right? Is the drawing a matrix from which these violated volumes originate or unfold? Or is it, on the contrary, a compression or condensation of these sculpted fragments, that is, a two-dimensional afterthought? More generally, what does a sculptor need a drawing for? And what lessons can we draw from the work of a sculptor draftsman? These questions come to mind when one considers the output of Edmé Bouchardon 2 centuries earlier. For not only did Bouchardon draw consistently and abundantly throughout his career, it is also that the outstanding quality of his drawings, both in the sense of their exceptional technical brilliance and their aesthetic originality and consistency, makes one wonder about their function in and relation to his practice as a sculptor. It is hard to think of any other artist who inhabited the hyphenated denomination sculptor, draftsman more completely than Bouchardon. But what exactly do we make of his extensive deployment of both chalk and ébauchoir? How do these practices in the two mediums interact or intersect? Recent scholarship, which includes the excellent catalogue for the current exhibition, has emphasized the central role drawing played in Bouchardon's career. As Edouard Kopp has shown, the artist self-consciously embraced the medium as the means of artistic self-definition and self-promotion. He inaugurated the practice of exhibiting drawings at the Salon, where in 1737 he included his virtuoso renditions of historical subjects, such as the Pariglia, based on Ovid's Fasti, in red chalk. Such ambitious compositions aimed at dispelling the aura of manual craft that lingered on in the public perception of sculptor in the 18th century. With the help of his supporter and friend Comte de Caylus, Bouchardon fashioned himself as a persona of a learned artist, and drawing played an important part in this self-construction. But drawing was, for Bouchardon, also a studio tool, and it is in this capacity that I would like to consider it today. I'm interested in the preparatory function of Bouchardon's drawings. How did the artist understand the function of his chalk studies, and how exactly did he use them to produce three-dimensional forms? While we have only limited verbal accounts of how Bouchardon worked, his studio having been notoriously inaccessible to the visitors, with the notable exceptions of Caylus and another friend and supporter, Mariette, we may treat the drawings themselves as a material evidence of this process. Consider, for instance, Bouchardon's preparatory studies for Love carrying a bow from Hercules' club. There's 9 of them, drawn on large sheets of similar dimensions, roughly 62 by 46 centimeters, each featuring the same young man who served as a model for the figure of Love in different poses. This is another 3, and the last set. Seen together, these studies provide a full-circle view of the figure, the idea materialized in the promotional cardboard cutout of the series made for the Louvre exhibitions. What purpose did these series originally serve? As Guilhem Scherf put it, here we find the germ of the idea that characterizes the work, the winding composition that invites the viewer to move around the statue and view it from multiple angles. The idea has been emphasized by the exhibition display, where some of the drawings are shown together with the statue. But this integrated display only makes the question of their precise function the more intriguing. Why exactly did the sculptor need to have the multiple viewpoints graphically represented, indeed spelled out in this way? Why draw in the round when one can model directly in 3 dimensions in wax or clay? One advantage, as Comte de Caylus noted, was that it was faster to draw than to model. Furthermore, drawing offered a permanent record of every view, while each alteration of the objects in the process of modeling it in wax or clay erased the previous solution. These advantages of the sketch are evident in Lorenzo Ghiberti's rehearsal of the pose for one of the figures for the flagellation of Christ on his first Florentine baptistry door. But Bouchardon's drawings are different. They are not the artist's initial ideas of the pose jotted down on a page, but rather careful and complex visual elaborations of the already fixed bodily pose from different angles. The completeness of these remarkable figural exercises in lines and strokes, and the evidence of time and effort the artist put into executing them, do not exactly conform to the notions of efficacy and speed evoked by Caylus as the obvious merits of drawing for sculptors. It seems that Bouchardon went into such mimetic trouble exclusively for his own sake. His studies were not presentation drawings, nor were they meant to be reproduced as prints to feed the demand of artists, collectors, and amateurs for such images, as were, for example, some of Bouchardon's Académie, or his studies for the geniuses of the seasons for the Grenelle fountain that Desmarteau reproduced in crayon manner, which you can see in the exhibition. The sanguines for the statue of Love remained in the sculptor's studio and were bequeathed to the Louvre by his descendants. Clearly, they were useful for the sculptor. The question is how. The comparison between them and the final sculpture reveals notable differences. The detailed muscular articulation of the youth's body and his carefully registered physiognomy, including his silly grins and shyly flirtatious glances that produce an uncanny effect of carnal presence, did not fully translate into three-dimensional form. Bouchardon's exceptionally smooth finish that secured his reputation as an expert in rendering skin palpable attenuated the muscular specificity of flesh underneath. Nor did the individuated facial features and the gaze find their way into the final version, where the god's smile is more discreet and his eyes are blinded, suggesting, as Katie Scott has observed, the blindness of desire personified by the god. Although when the statue was displayed, some complaints were made about Love's excessively specific adolescent appearance, awkward bodily proportions, too large feet, his bewinged marble body, propped on its mythic attributes, was considerably removed from the flesh and bone appearance of its model in red chalk. These records of a posing session are marked then by a certain surplus in relation to the sculpture, an excess manifest in their number, their mode of presentation of the model, and the qualities of execution, all of which cannot be easily justified by their preparatory status. In what way exactly did this series of elaborate graphic incarnations help the sculptor carve his statue of Love? How did these drawings as drawings, in their formal, technical, and material specificity, contribute to the generation of the final form? To answer these questions, we need to have a better sense of the role of drawing in the sculptor's process. Sculptors did not always draw. In the Renaissance, notwithstanding such examples as the Ghiberti drawing I have shown, drawing was not considered an obvious preparatory medium for a sculptor. Unlike painters, the sculptors were not even necessarily expected to know how to draw. As Vasari put it, because sculptors sometimes do not practice lines and contours and consequently cannot draw on paper, they make men, animals, and other three-dimensional things in clay or wax, and in this way they do the same thing as those who draw perfectly on paper or another surface. Michelangelo was among the sculptors who did draw, but the sheet of his sketches in the Ashmolean Museum illustrates, if inadvertently, Vasari's views of drawing as essentially a painter's rather than a sculptor's practice. It is a figure for the Sistine Chapel's fresco of the Last Judgment that Michelangelo renders meticulously in sanguine, while his ideas for the sculpture for the tomb of Julius II, jotted down in the lower part of the sheet, are barely outlined. The use of drawing in the Renaissance was obviously more complex, but recent research has confirmed, its practice by sculptors in this period was limited and inconsistent. The 18th century marks a radical change in the status of drawing. With its embrace as the principal tool of artistic training at the French Academy, the practice of drawing came to be seen as necessary for any artist aspiring to distinguish him or herself from a mere artisan. Bouchardon's father, himself an architect and sculptor, recognized this when, to support his son's artistic inclinations, he hired a live model for him to practice drawing every day, as Caylus tells us, despite the costs involved. As a result, the young Bouchardon was already a skilled draftsman when he arrived at the French Academy in Rome in 1723. This could not be said of all aspiring artists who won the Prix de Rome, as Nicolas Vlegels, the director of the French Academy in Rome in Bouchardon's Time reported, some young sculptors still arrived from Paris without being able to draw properly. It was precisely to ameliorate this state of affairs that Vleughels developed a new rigorous academic curriculum based in drawing after antique sculptures and painting of modern Italian masters. For Bouchardon, who spent 9 years at the Roman Academy under Vleughels' tutelage, this was a key formative experience. By copying, the young artist developed his particularly suggestive mode of drawing that made the body come alive on the page, even if his models, such as the Hercules Farnese, were statuary forms. It was, however, not only a style, but a new understanding and approach to the medium of drawing that Bouchardon acquired in Rome due to the curricular innovations at the Palazzo Mancini and also his immersion in the international culture of antiquarianism thriving in the Eternal City. Both contexts shaped his mental habits as well as his mode of working. This is evident in Bouchardon's series of 18 rotated views of the torso and the head of the Laocoon, most likely after plaster cast, in red chalk. Their size is large, similar to the size of love studies. As Thomas Maxotet has argued in his perceptive analysis of these works, to study the sculpture in this way meant committing to memory a complete image of form, one that could be gained only with difficulty from the original, given that in reality our view of it is always partial. This mnemic approach to drawing has been related to the new epistemology of the art object that emerged in the antiquarian circles in Rome and at the time in parallel developments in Paris. Ancient artifacts were studied in a new way that privileged sensory experience of their material aspects as the basis of cultural and artistic knowledge of the past. Bouchardon's Roman copies served this purpose in a most conspicuous way by the cumulative character of their views, their careful staging of the object, and their relentlessly meticulous execution. Yet these and other aspects of the series indicate that memorizing antiquity was not the only issue at stake. The endless multiplication of views exceeded the standard protocols of imitation and cannot be explained solely by a didactic or antiquarian purposes. The series also speaks of the artist's need to situate his own body in relation to the object he studies by drawing it. The series enacts the draftsman perusal of sculpture from all sides, and it is this experience of it as much as the form itself that the drawings record. Evident in these repeated sightings is a desire to seize the object, and in their attempt at exhaustiveness, they hint at some anxiety involved in this. There is, in other words, a subjective dimension to these ostensibly dispassionate and impersonal views. I would suggest that the Roman experience helped Bouchardon develop a particular performative understanding of drawing. By this I mean that it was not only the means of visualizing, memorizing, or conceptualizing an object, but a tool of his personal, at once kinesthetic and subjective engagement with it. It was this performative dimension of his drawing practice, in the sense that I'm proposing here, that was brought to the fore by Bouchardon's use of his Roman drawings when he returned to Paris. As Queluz reported, the artist plastered the walls of his studio at the Louvre with these large sheets. A savvy gesture of self-promotion that, as it has been said, signaled Bouchardon's wish to emulate the drawing collectors and amateurs, the display also served another personal function. Surrounding himself with his own past productions, Bouchardon created a self-referential space of aesthetic and corporeal self-experience. Not just a mnemic archive of form, nor merely a show of his skill and accomplishments as a draftsman for others to see, this self-referential display transformed his studio into a stage on which to witness and reenact the relation to the object, a relation that informed the sculptor's work. This brings us back to the Statue of Love. There clearly is a connection between the drawing method Bouchardon developed in his Roman work and his studies for love. Multiplying the body image from different points of view, just as the drawing of the Laocoon did, the studies of love defined form as a function of the viewer's experience, which is first and foremost the draftsman sculptor's own experience. But in relation to his Roman copies, the drawings for love bring the presence of the draftsman body more emphatically to the fore, registering the demonstrative way in which the young man assumes his poses, presenting himself emphatically for the draftsman gaze, and hinting at the interpersonal connection, the evident eye contact between them. The drawings point, if indirectly, to Bouchardon's involvement in their production. Moreover, and more directly, the technical aspects of these drawings offer a vivid testimony of the draftsman body at work. Bouchardon performs the basic operations of drawing, contour, hatching, and rubbing, rather than simply using them. A standard device in the academic routine of life drawing, the contour turns in Bouchardon's hands into a demonstration of his facility with line. Diderot reported that he could, with one uninterrupted stroke, trace the outlines of a figure from head to toe, and even from the tip of the toe to the top of the head, in whatever pose, and this while preserving a total correctness of drawing, the truth of contours and proportions. You can see what Diderot meant in one of Bouchardon's masterful academies, now at the Fog. Although the contour was retraced here in a thicker stroke, this work was to be engraved by Pierre Aveline for the second volume of Huquier's Livre de diverses figures d'académie dessinées d'après nature. The original, which you're looking at here, the original decisive sweep of the draftsman line, whether it was traced from the bottom up or the other way around, may still be appreciated. The virtuosic contour also distinguished the studies for love, where, given the relational and interpersonal dimension of these drawings described earlier, its decisiveness may be taken to signal a double function, an outline of the model's body and a borderline separating it from that of the draftsman. We may grasp this aspect better through a brief detour to the work of a contemporary artist, Anne Hamilton. In a video loop that was part of her installation Ghost, a Border Act of 2000, Hamilton drew an uninterrupted line on a sheet of paper attached to a table, filming this act at the same time with her portable camera. Holding a camera in her left hand and the pencil in the right, she ran around the perimeter of the table to draw its outline while recording it. And I'll show you a brief clip of this to give you some sense of that. Okay, you got the picture. Wait. Okay, this is not, of course, an illustration of how Bouchardon drew, but but it throws into sharper relief the performative aspect of his approach to contour. Hamilton's act foregrounds the dimension of the contour as a boundary between the drawn object and the drawing body. Even in this short clip, you can hear both the sound of the artist's pencil and of her breathing body as she runs and draws. This is what the drawing at its most basic entails. To outline an object, in this case a table, is also to separate it from one's own body. The operation of contour is, in this sense, not merely mimetic. It is an enactment of one's body's relation to the object. I suggest that this was the fundamental sense of Bouchardon's deliberate enactments of the contour. Similar argument can be made about another notable aspect of Bouchardon's technique, namely his use of hatching. A standard procedure for shadowing or modeling, Charles-Antoine Jambert's drawing manual devoted a whole section to the description of how to ombrer un dessin en argent. Hatching in Bouchardon becomes hypertrophic. It is unusually dense and emphatic. It not only dramatically sets off the figure from the background, but also announces itself as an indexical trace of the draftsman body. We can almost hear the swish of Bouchardon's chalkstick as it covers the surface of the sheet in tight and rhythmic strokes. Moreover, as his self-portrait of 1745 illustrates, he uses hatchings to cover the entire surface of drawing, such that it appears, paradoxically, inasmuch as it is so highly mediated, as an imprint of the sitter's body. By pressing his crayon hard against the surface, or more gently stroking or rubbing it, a modeling technique described in the drawing manuals by the term grainer, literally to granulate or to rub, the draftsman enlists the texture of the paper to speak of and for his body. These performative qualities of execution, aspects that enhance but also exceed the mimetic purpose, led to the description of Bouchardon's drawings as sculptural. Yet these techniques do not correspond to sculptural operations of rough hewing, carving, or polishing. There is a gap between how the figure of love was drawn and how it was sculpted, which is to say that none of the graphic drama of the image was necessary for modeling or carving it. A drawing in Bouchardon's practice is not a blueprint for a sculpture, but an invitation to, or a performative anticipation of it. Its performativity has to do with the sculptor's need to situate himself in relation to his object. It is not by chance that we see no trace of drawing being used by Bouchardon in the only depiction of the sculptor at work that we have, namely the caricature of him modeling Getty's bust. The production of carnal presence through drawing served then a particular preparatory purpose by providing an imaginary frame for the sculptor's experience, which was fundamentally also a mode of self-experience. The function of drawing as a means of situating and sustaining the sculptor's body in the process of preparation is most emphatically illustrated by the corpus of Bouchardon's studies for the monument of Louis XV. The unusually large number of these studies, and I'm showing you the print representing the monument in situ, the unusually large number of these studies, there are about 400 of them, has often been commented upon. Unusual is also the draftsman's focus on the horse rather than the king. The number of sheets featuring the animal's body is disproportionately larger than those depicting the rider. Finally, it is the wide typological range of studies from annotated écorchés to quasi-portraits of the animal, and their detailed and repetitive nature that is surprising. So many takes on just one leg and up-close views of the hoof, as well as the multiplying views of head and its details. The reasons for these studies, executed in the fairly advanced stage of Bouchardon's work on the project, about 4 years after he had produced the initial model for the statue and had continued to work on it in plaster, is most likely that the artist needed to check his work against nature. It is, however, still quite puzzling why he had gone to such length and drew in so much detail. Edouard Capre has offered that Bouchardon's depictions were motivated by a naturalist impulse to establish a new standard of truth in drawing from nature, thus making a visual contribution to natural history as a discipline that was being then defined by Buffon. This is definitely an important connection. There are, however, still some issues that remain unaddressed, one of them being the at once highly deliberate and unusual points of view the artist adopted for studying the animal, and the related issue of his choice of anatomical details for depiction. What, for example, may have been the purpose of the up-close views of the horse's genitals, of which there are several, two of them featured on one sheet on the left, or of its anus, which the draftsman deliberately raised the horse's tail to see on the right. How useful were these intrusive sightings of the animal's body for casting its final form? Were they indeed necessitated by the preparatory process, or are we to attribute them to the artist losing himself in his project, being carried away by his naturalist zeal, or perhaps simply procrastinating? An intriguing aspect of these particular details is the highly specific point of view from which they were taken. It is not only the horse's anatomy, but the draftsman's position in looking at it that the drawings record. In an anecdote repeated by Grimm in the Correspondance littéraire, a visitor to the Roule studio one day found Bouchardon lying on the floor under the horse's belly as he drew it. This might be one of those drawings that he produced in this way. The story is often cited to make a point about the unusually intimate rapport the artist managed to establish with the animal, which he certainly did. But the anecdote is also a testimony to Bouchardon's willingness to engage his body directly, even to endanger it, in the process of depiction. This idea is confirmed by other views, notably the one taken from above, which the draftsman must have obtained by hoisting himself and hovering over it as he drew. Again, what was this view needed for? As a testimony to the artist's diligent concern with accuracy, it seems excessive, given that hardly anyone would have been able to appreciate it once the statue was in place, unless one flew over it in a balloon. Studies such as these do not seem to have, in other words, a direct relevance either to the development of the statue's form or to the process of casting it. Rather, they have something to do with a key aspect of his process. My argument is that the artist executed these views so as to articulate the place of his own body, not only his gaze, in relation to the object. The sculptor's body is here, in other words, not only an instrument of visual perception, but also of kinesthetic relation to the object. Taken together, the numerous sheets documenting the artist's unending empirical quest to know by experiencing and drawing the horse's body amounted to a support structure that maintained the model in place, as it were, in the sculptor's mental and physical space. In this sense, the function of this drawing corpus, which included carefully measured views, may be compared to the measuring or reference points a sculptor uses for transferring one plaster onto another, larger one. Apparently, Bouchardon needed a far greater number of these than other sculptors, which surprised his contemporaries, including Charles-Nicolas Cochin. While, as Cochin noted, it would have been understandable for a journeyman to use these points so extensively, it was not expected of an accomplished sculptor. An analogy can be drawn between Bouchardon's need for the security of a precise measuring apparatus or transferring apparatus to hold his model in place and his need of the supportive network of drawings to hold the idea of the sculpture in his mind and body. They provided a relational structure to sustain his rapport, at once physical and imaginary, to his work. Drawing provided a visual aid representing not the shape of the horse, but his relation, but the sculptor's relation to it. This idiosyncratically empirical approach is also evident in Bouchardon's drawings for the caryatids that flank the four sides of the pedestal supporting the statue of the king. They are here in the lower part. These you're seeing two. They represented the four virtues of strength, love of peace, prudence, and justice. I will not get into the question of the monument's iconographic program, of which these figures were part, except to note that they were by no means standard for a royal monument of this kind. In the earlier equestrian monuments, the one on Pont-Neuf and on Place de Victoire, figures of enchained slaves personifying the nations vanquished by the king were used. The slaves became controversial in Bouchardon's time, with Voltaire proposing in his comments on the monument on the Place de Victoire to substitute these figures with an image of happy citizens, an advice heeded by Pigalle. In Pigalle's monument to Louis XV in Reims, a seated figure of a citizen on your right was paired with an allegorical figure of the benevolence of the royal government. Bouchardon's choice of the allegorical figure of virtues had to do with his conception of the monument as an image of a benevolent rather than belligerent king. Rendered as caryatids, they supported the monument both in a physical and symbolic sense. What is most striking about these full-bodied figures drawn on large sheets is their consistent and even strange naturalism given their allegorical function. It is the women's bodies in their carefully recorded physical appearance that the draftsman invested with an allegorical mission, an idea confirmed by the way in which he played down their attributes. The latter were either laying at their feet or carried by the women casually, almost absent-mindedly. The way Justice holds her scales here on the right in her hand as if it were a pair of gloves epitomizes this approach, signaling the privilege of the body itself over the more traditional attributional definition of the virtues. Moreover, the bodies of the virtues were rendered with uncommon frankness and specificity. They illustrate Bouchardon's vision of femininity, untouched by the heterosexual logic of grace that shaped the gaze other artists of his generation, notably François Boucher, cast on the woman's body. Instead of subsuming the incidence of flesh by the graceful arabesque of the overall bodily shape, as did Boucher, Bouchardon records the inelegantly protruding bellies and the tightened muscles of women's thighs and buttocks, which he does even when he designs a fountain of graces, 1737 for Uquier. His caryatids are products of a respectful and disinterested naturalism, freed from any obligation to please. The artist's concern is rather with the poses and gestures which are here thoroughly unrhetorical, non-allegorical, motivated only by the nature of physical action these women perform, that is, supporting the pedestal on which the statue stands. In this regard, Bouchardon's approach to the female nude brings Degas' bathers to mind, a connection I evoke simply to underscore the radical nature of Bouchardon's 18th century naturalism. He visualizes the weight-bearing function of his figures' entire bodies, and most intriguingly, by their feet, balanced precariously on the narrow two-step pedestal, not an easy place to stand on, especially when one carries the weight these women do. This is one. This is another one, note the feet, and this is the third one. The minuscule adjustments of position evident when we compare some of the drawings register the artist's search for the most natural pose. What is thus registered is not only the woman's body, but also that of the draftsman. The relation between the two defined not on affective, psychological, or sexual in these terms, but in purely phenomenological ones. The sheet where the woman's body is half obscured by the pedestal epitomizes this, in a particular sense, shared vision, a body as it reveals itself to a situated viewer, here the draftsman. In this way, the caryatids appear as transitional figures, not only between the figure of the king and the surroundings, but also in that they mediate the artist's relation to his work. They speak of the crucial role of drawing as the means of including the artist's body as both an agent and a witness of the process of creation. I will conclude by noting briefly that this understanding of the relation between drawing and the body is also signaled in Bouchardon's self-portraits and two other directly self-referential drawings. An intriguing self-image can be found in one of the artist's Roman sketchbooks upstairs, known as Vademecum, now at the Morgan Library. We infer the sitter's identity from his characteristic facial features, confirmed by another later self-portrait, now lost, but one that we know from a counterproof, where Bouchardon is shown wearing a similar tricorne hat over carefully curled locks. The point of view he used to present himself in his Roman likeness is, however, unusual. Shown leaning forward with his eyes closed, his face held in his hand, the artist seems to be absorbed in thought, perhaps in a process of creative conception. I would suggest that Bouchardon adopted here a pose of a figure from Raphael painting, which he may have seen or copied in Rome, and which was later illustrated in the 1755 edition of Jean Bert's Méthode. He adjusted it, however, by introducing the intriguing gesture of hands framing his face. As Juliette Trey has noted, he further emphasized the hands, retracing them in a harder contour. This emphasis, which was clearly deliberate, suggests not only the importance of touch at the expense of vision, his eyes being closed, but also of the artist's own body as a tool and a point of reference in his process. Bouchardon's two metonymic self-portraits, drawings of his own hand holding a porte-crayon on the left, and another in which his hand rests against a portfolio of drawing, make a similar point. The care he brought to the execution of these sheets, and to his hands in particular, may certainly be linked, as it has been, to the new conceptualization of the artist's hand in the discourse of connoisseurship, wherein it functioned as a shorthand, as it were, for the artist's individual style. But here it speaks also to the particular importance of the artist's own body in his process. Testimonies to his privilege of crayon over ébauchoir, these fragmentary images stage the artist's body as inseparable, in a sense, from his medium. As such, they epitomize the relational and performative character of Bouchardon's drawing practice. Thank you.